Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome to today's program Ron Lackey, who's a VP at Descartes. And today we're going to be talking about accelerating supply chain speed and efficiency with global trade data. Now, global trade data is one of those topics that a lot of people don't know about, and people that think about global trade data just think about it as just information. To populate different documents and things like that, but it plays a very critical role in a variety of supply chain processes, and we're going to touch upon that today. So and Ron's an expert in this area, and certainly look forward to his comments in this area. Just to remind you, if you are joining us live today, part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is to make this interactive. So if you've got any questions for Ron as we're having our conversation, you can do so via the submit a question button or the chat feature, and we'll try to weave that into the conversation. So with that, Ron, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Adrian. Appreciate that.
Before we kind of dive into the topic, I always like to ask my guests, to tell us briefly about kind of their background and how they got involved with supply chain logistics. So why don't you tell us briefly a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved with supply chain logistics and this whole area of global trade, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at Descartes.
So in the 90s, I was in the e-learning space, and that was really about content. And over the course of the 90s, I watched that content ultimately end up inside of ERP systems like SAP and Oracle, automating a lot of what they were trying to do. And in 2001, I joined KPMG, who at the time owned Customs Info. And it took me a while to start to understand all the complexities of trade, but two, it also took me a while to figure out that I was back in the content business again. And so ultimately, I knew that this data that we were dealing with at a pretty simple level was going to, over the next 10 years, was going to be uploaded into SAP, Oracle, what have you. So that's really how I got into trade. Obviously, 13 years later, I'm still in trade. I'm still enjoying it. And in June of this year, CI was acquired by Descartes, and I'm currently the VP of content at Descartes.
Great, yeah, and I know you and I, went back. I've known each other for quite some time, back from the Customs Info days, and certainly the announcement, as you mentioned, of Descartes acquiring Customs Info was a pretty big announcement in this area in terms of the role that trade content is going to play within the broader, from a global network perspective and global trade processes. So let's start with a basic question, because some people may not be familiar with what exactly is global trade data. So why don't you tell us, what is global trade data and how is it gathered and maintained?
So global trade data is really all of the information required to do an international transaction, and that may include HTS codes. It may include rules and regulations, both from an export standpoint and from an import standpoint. Today, the big push is other government agencies, not only coming into the U.S., but also other government agencies around the world. And so the goal is to provide the user with all the information, all the global trade information they need to keep the velocity of that supply chain up, so they don't have any delays, so their containers aren't getting stopped, and so their packages aren't getting stopped. If you look at how it's done, the interesting thing about this space is that the majority of the companies that do what we do, if you look at those organizations, the majority of the people in those organizations are working with content. They're collecting it, they're normalizing it, and they're putting it into a flavor that the customer is demanding. A flavor meaning they may need this to upload into one ERP system or another, and they may need specialized data for that. So if you look at our company anyway, we have an entire group of people who are dedicated just to looking for updates and constantly scanning that information. So as soon as we find an update, we can push that to our clients.
Now something like, HTS codes. Can you kind of describe for the average user who may not know what an HTS code is, what that is, and is this something that's U.S. focused? Is this something that's globally focused?
I love that question because a lot of people don't know, and if you're a trader, you kind of take a view that everybody understands what that is, but not everybody does. So every country around the world has a tariff book, and the tariff book is just a huge schedule of anything on the planet can fit into the tariff book, and it's a huge schedule of codes, which is a harmonized tariff code, and the corresponding duties or taxes, and in some countries the regulations as well. So, and that's called classification, and classification has to happen. That's really the cornerstone. That's the first thing that must be done in order to get your duties, taxes, and regulations. So, any country has a tariff book, and a big part of our job, and I think we cover over 160 countries now, I think a big part of our job is making sure that we have the latest and greatest tariffs for the countries that we're shipping to, so our customers don't have a container that gets held up because they have the wrong HS code. Because that can be, as you probably know, a container getting held up for a week or two because of incorrect paperwork can cost the shipper, $5,000 or $10,000.
Yeah, no, great point. You already touched upon a little bit here, kind of moving from, what is global trade data, and in this, and as you just talked about HTS being an example of that, to, why is it important, right? Which business processes depend on this data? Is this just mainly for import and export processes?
Yeah, I would say mainly it is, but at the same time, even for domestic transactions, companies should be checking the denied party lists. There's a story that happened many years ago, but Geico, the car insurance company, was busted because they sold car insurance to a guy who was on the DPL list, and that happened in the States. So it is internationally focused, but people really need to understand all the rules and regulations before they do any sort of transaction.
Now, do you see companies, one of the things I've seen in the past is companies leverage this type of data, particularly kind of the classification piece and restricted party as well, when they're doing, product design, right? Or when they're doing supply chain network design, because things, a simple change in the design of the product can change the classification of a product from A to B, and that can have big implications in terms of whether it might qualify for preferential trade treatment or not, or whether it can be imported into a country or not, so on and so forth. Is that something that you see as well in terms of companies kind of leveraging global trade data in other areas such as sourcing, product development, network design?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at how companies utilize this data, it's somewhat different. So with 3PLs, for example, I think their utilization of the data is very tactical, right? They're moving a box from one place to another, or a container from point A to point B. But shippers and companies really need to use this data more strategically. So if I'm, as you just pointed out, if I have a new product or I need to build a factory to supply brake pads to Europe, I really need to understand this data from a strategic standpoint to understand where's the best place to build that factory, or where's the best place to source those brake pads from. And so if companies aren't utilizing this information, they may make incorrect decisions, business decisions, if they're not fully factoring in all the things we just talked about: classification, duty rates, restricted parties, and just global rules and regulations.
Yeah, you just touched upon a topic that I was going to ask you about, kind of how, 3PLs, specifically freight forwarders and brokers might use this data, versus, shippers, manufacturers, retailers. So it seems like that, one might be a little bit more tactical in terms of helping to get, speed the flow and facilitate the flow of goods through borders and so forth. Whereas obviously for manufacturers and retailers, that could be part of it, but being able to leverage this content, across other business processes seems to be kind of the key differential there. One of the things I'm curious about is there's so much buzz these days around e-commerce and omni-channel fulfillment and everything else, and international shipments has been one of the areas that many online retailers have always struggled with, where someone from Europe is looking to buy something from the U.S. and how the U.S. retailer then figures out what the total cost is going to be and how to ship that over to that foreign customer, and vice versa. It could be any kind of global or international transaction, not U.S. centric either. So that's been kind of a challenge. So what's the role of global trade data in kind of e-commerce, and is there a difference between B2B applications of global trade data and B2C applications?
Yeah, this is my favorite part of the industry, really, because it's very different and it's changing very fast. And according to a white paper that eBay put out, e-sellers experience 60% less trade friction than a traditional commercial trader moving a container. But the trick is that there's a lot more e-sellers out there selling on eBay or on Amazon who don't have the experience that somebody working for Hitachi for 20 years does. So in a relative term, there is a lot more trade friction for the e-sellers because they don't have the experience. As far as how they're the same and how they're different, there's a lot more visibility today than there ever has been in the past, whether you're shipping a container or whether you're shipping a sweater overseas. And the difference is that 15 years ago, you would have an idea when your container was going to hit Long Beach, but that was okay. I mean, as far as the supply chain and the velocity, as long as you knew within a day or two when it was coming in, it was probably going to be okay. What's changing is the visibility tools, the other kinds of tools that Descartes, for example, provides, where we can track containers around the globe. We really have a clear picture of where they're at. On the e-seller side, on the courier and post side, it's so much better today than it was. I mean, you probably get an email on your phone 30 seconds after they've delivered a package to your porch, right? But what's really interesting is that consumer demands are increasing, and consumers don't only want to know that my package is going to show up on Thursday. They want to know that my package is going to show up on Thursday between 3 and 4 o'clock. And so that last mile is a very stringent process. That last mile takes a lot of coordination, a lot of communication, and a lot of data. And so that's an exciting part of the industry that's changing. But at the end of the day, I can't promise a customer that a package is going to get there Thursday at 3 o'clock if I never got it into the country in the first place because I misclassified my product and some customs officer doesn't like the number I've used. So it's all intertwined. And if you look down the road 5-10 years, it's really going to have to become an exact science. So if I make that commitment on a delivery date and time, that I can get that product into the country when it needs to get into the country.
No, that's a great point. I mean, obviously, consumers are driving so much of supply chain processes today, and all of us, as you noted, as consumers are becoming much more demanding in terms of, having much more visibility into the status of our orders, having much more predictability and certainty in terms of when things are going to arrive. And I think the other important piece of it is where I think historically a lot of the e-commerce retailers have struggled is, having the accurate price. How much is this going to cost me, right? Because when being able to factor in the duties and taxes and everything else, early on, a lot of e-retailers just couldn't factor in that kind of information up front at the selling point. Are we there yet today? Are you seeing folks doing that today?
Yeah, I think most companies are doing a really good job of that. And I'm not exaggerating here, but 5 or 7 years ago, the amount of returns and rejected items that we saw from our customers' viewpoint was it was incredible, because a lady in Belgium, for example, would order a $50 sweater, and the DHL guy shows up and says, "Here's your sweater. Oh, by the way, you owe me $30 for duties and taxes." And she just says, I don't want it. And that is a punitive, financially punitive thing for the shipper, and they really found ways quickly to solve that. Now, we're still helping companies solve that problem, but it's a much smaller problem than it used to be.
So let's talk now about, and you touch upon a little bit, how is global trade data and kind of the associated technology different today than, say, 10 years ago when you first got started, doing this kind of work?
Lots of changes. I can tell you that. It happened a long time ago, but 9/11 changed everything. It not only changed everything for the United States, but for other countries as well who were concerned about their security. And so governments invested a lot of money in automation for two reasons: one, security, and two, to create revenue. And it's a lot easier to make sure that the government is getting paid what they're due if we know exactly what's coming into the country. So governments have invested in automation, and they've required traders to communicate with them electronically. And one of the things about electronic communication and automation is it doesn't take a whole lot more to request more information and to supply more information. So this trend is certainly not going away. I can't tell you what it's going to look like in 10 years, but I can tell you that what the governments are going to require traders to provide to them is going to be a lot more than it is today. And for security reasons, if you want to just throw some things on the wall and see if they stick, for security reasons, I could see governments really wanting to understand exactly who the product is going to. And I'm not talking about end-use type issues and parties, but I'm talking about products that are going into large warehouses where they get distributed from a certain place overseas. I think that they're going to want to know more information about exactly where those products are going.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I remember when, obviously after 9/11, with so many different programs that were initiated by customs, in terms of really having more visibility and having more knowledge about, imports and exports, and the various programs that came into that. Obviously on the ocean side, with 10+2 and things like that, and certainly this has kind of impacted the all sorts of shipments that are crossing borders. And I think you're right. I think as these processes become much more automated, as customs agencies become much more electronic, I think the request for information will only increase, right? And I think we'll put pressure on companies to continue to invest in this area to be able to comply with those information requirements. So when you look at companies and the way they're leveraging global trade data, and when it comes to leveraging global trade data to its fullest potential, what's the biggest opportunity you see that companies are missing?
Trade agreements. Definitely trade agreements. We've done some ROI analysis with our customers in regards to how much money they would save if they made the investment to take advantage of trade agreements. And as you probably know, that's not a small investment. A lot of people didn't utilize trade agreements many moons ago because there was just a lot of paperwork and it took a lot of human beings. But with today's applications and software, you can automate a lot of that. And the ROI on some of these projects that we've done with our customers has been breathtaking. And I don't use that term lightly, but I mean, we've seen ROIs of hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, of course, those are with billion-dollar-plus companies. But I think there's a lot of opportunity, even for mid-sized companies, to really take a look at the trade agreements and understand how that's going to affect their business from a sourcing perspective, and how it's going to affect their business just from a duty savings perspective, because those savings are out there. People just need to understand whether or not they can take advantage of those. The other thing that I would add to that is what I call a virtual transaction. Today, we have so much electronic information. We have so much history. We know what happens when a transaction has taken place. We have the history of that transaction. And as you know, shipping internationally to a new country for the first time, there's a lot of unknowns, and sometimes things go wrong. But we shouldn't make that mistake twice. If we're shipping the same product to the same country, to the same people, we should be able to do a virtual transaction on that, take our product, run that through a process, make sure we have all of the boxes checked. So we're 99% sure that when that product gets shipped, we're not going to have any issues and we're not going to have any delays.
No, great examples there, and I'm kind of curious. You talk about the big opportunity, particularly with trade agreements. Last year I wrote a blog post because I had gone to a conference, and there were these two very well-known companies, billion-dollar-plus companies, that were doing basically classifications, managing the classification process and their preferential trade processes using Excel spreadsheets. And they would bring in every once in a while, some trade expert lawyers to come in just to kind of audit or kind of take a view of review what they were doing. And I asked the question. I said, why are you using the Excel spreadsheets? I mean, is it there's so many capabilities out there from a technology side to kind of automate this more, streamline this more, and obviously I think it's a huge risk perspective, or you might be leaving money on the table, or exposing yourself to some fines if you're misclassifying products, so on and so forth. And the answer was, internally at those companies, they didn't view global trade as kind of a strategic thing. It was just kind of paperwork and kind of lower on the totem pole. I mean, do you view that as a challenge? Do you still see a lot of companies that are still doing this kind of stuff, even big, large companies using spreadsheets and manual processes to, manage this whole area?
We see that all the time, and it still doesn't cease to amaze me. And the problem is really at the executive level, because if the executives look at trade compliance as a cost center, and at the same point, if the trade compliance folks look at themselves as a cost center, then they're going to get treated like a cost center. But at the end of the day, there is so much information, so much valuable business information embedded in quote-unquote global trade compliance and data that the executives really should be paying attention to this information from a business perspective. And we've talked about them here today before. Trade agreements, sourcing, where should I build my factory? And unless the executives start looking at this as a business data and data points to understand, then not much is going to change, and trade compliance will continue to be a cost center. And with being a cost center comes probably not a lot of budget money to go out and automate and buy trade management systems and buy classification engines such as our GTD product.
Great points, and I agree. I mean, I think it really has to, companies really have to, view this more strategically and view it as a risk, from a risk management standpoint as well. And I think when you talk about risk, I think that certainly always gets the attention of the CFO and the CEO and so forth. Ron, we're kind of coming up on time here, so I'm going to ask you my last question as kind of a way to wrap up. I mean, what questions should companies ask themselves to assess the quality of their global trade data and whether they're leveraging it, effectively?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first one is do they have a system in place that is constantly looking for updates to make sure that their products are classified, up to date? And that's not a process that should happen every 6 months or every 12 months. That's a process that should happen at least monthly. Because again, one wrong number and the container's hung up and boom, we've spent $10,000 in dock fees. Two, trade agreements. Again, everybody should be looking at that, understanding the ROI. And by the way, it doesn't cost a company a lot of money to do an ROI study on the trade agreements. It's very simple math. And the third piece, I think, Adrian, is really a shameless plug. However, I think the third thing, a best practice, is getting this information from companies like Descartes and other companies that provide this information. And the reason for that is because that's what we do. That's how we pay the mortgage. We get up every day and make sure that our numbers and our data is correct. And it's not uncommon for us to go to a country's website and that website hasn't been updated, but they've had new data out for a month. And so we've already pushed that information to our clients. And again, we're trying to keep our clients out of trouble. We're trying to keep the velocity of that supply chain moving ahead so they don't have any delays, creating unhappy customers when the product doesn't get there on time. So I think those are the three things.
All good questions. You know, when I talk to folks about global trade management, you know, I typically talk about the 3 C's. You know, it's compliance, connectivity, you know, being able to connect with the different trading partners and customs agencies, and content. And I think content is the one that a lot of companies have historically overlooked. And, you know, the reality is, as you said, is, you know, it's not sexy, but it's very critical. And this type of data, you know, changes on a daily basis. And unless you've got a, you know, a pulse on that and are able to, you know, be as up to date as possible with that information, you know, that can have some, you know, serious consequences, either financial from a risk standpoint for companies. So it's something that I think, you know, it's important to kind of educate the market on, in terms of the important role that trade content plays, you know, as part of their global trade processes. You know, Ron, as always, you know, we always manage just to scratch the surface on these programs, on these topics, but I think we certainly covered a lot of great areas, and certainly appreciate you taking the time to at least get the conversation started on this very important topic.
Well, it's my pleasure, Adrian, and I love your program, by the way.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for those of you that joined us today live. We didn't get any questions, but if you are watching this program on demand and you want to ask Ron a question, you can find the episode on talkinglogistics.com, and you can, you know, post a question or a comment there, and I'm sure that Ron will be more than happy to, you know, respond via that platform. So with that, thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.